In the last episode, we saw the civil wars that broke out among the sons of Constantine as they fought over the pieces of their father's empire. Despite their family ties and clear dividing lines between them, they could not help but fight one another. Envy and jealousy and suspicion, as well as opportunities to gain power, ruled the day. And in the end, only one of Constantine's successors was left standing by the 350s AD. This man was Constantius II, middle son of Constantine the Great. Constantius had a daunting task ahead of him. Hordes of Alemanni were crossing over the Rhine, capturing Roman cities in the western provinces. On the eastern front, the Sassanid king Shapur ruled the Persian Empire and threatened invasion of Rome's eastern cities. And then, of course, there was the ongoing issues with Christianity. The empire was split between Nicene, Trinitarian Christianity on the one hand and Arianism on the other. Was it even possible to bring unity to this empire? Well, Constantius II would try. Would he be successful? We will talk about it on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 90, Constantius II and the Unity of the Roman Empire. In 353 AD, Constantine's last remaining son, Constantius II, ruled the Roman Empire alone. His last enemy, the usurper Magnentius, died on August 10, 353, and this brought a short era of undivided rule under Constantius II. It wouldn't last very long, only until 361. But this second son of Constantine did quite a bit of work in those last 8 years or so of his life to try to shore up the empire that he accumulated in large part by killing members of his own family, as well as a usurper. And I think what we see with Constantius II in this last phase of his life is a level of pragmatism. He did what he could to stabilize an empire that was beset by barbarian invasions and schisms in the church, and just a lot of constraints on his resources. The civil wars of the past few decades, plus the massive spending spree of Constantine, well, these didn't leave the empire in a very good position. It also didn't help, by the way, that Constantius II was an Arian, or at least leaned that way. So much of the Roman Empire was increasingly Trinitarian. And so Constantius, in many ways, was attempting to heal a Roman Empire that, at least in some quarters and some regions, didn't really want his help. Constantius was, in a lot of ways, like Hadrian, who we talked about way back in episodes 36 through 40. And why I compare Constantius to Hadrian is that Hadrian was a consolidator. He sought to build commonwealth out of the Roman Empire. And while Constantius II was not trying to build a commonwealth per se, he was a consolidator. He did not favor expansion. He wanted ecclesiastical unity rather than dogmatic rigidity. And he fought wars, but they were largely defensive wars, and they were very carefully led because he just did not have the resources to defend every part of the vast Roman border. So let's take a look at how Constantius tried to keep his newly won empire together. First, we have to think about his position, especially in the West. Constantius had to secure his authority in that region. These are Western provinces like Gaul and Spanish provinces, Great Britain, North Africa, and even Italy, and the city of Rome. Those places had largely supported emperors other than Constantius. So what did Constantius do to win them over? Well, he decided to send a man named Paulus, who was nicknamed the Chain, who was a kind of inquisitor and a man who was feared by many in the Roman Empire. This is what the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who lived during this period, said about Paulus the Chain. Quote, Paulus, surnamed the Chain from the number of his victims, was now dispatched to the east with a large force. He was a man of keen intelligence, but cruel and inexorable in his punishments. Constantius gave him unlimited authority to search out and punish all who had been in any way connected to the usurpation. That's Ammianus Marcellinus. So what did the chain do? Well, he investigated military officers, officials, people that weren't in the army, just some regular civilians. Anybody who could be credibly accused of having sided with Magnentius. He didn't just stay in Rome, he went all the way as far as the island of Great Britain, torturing and punishing high officials. There were some kangaroo trials, and this inquisition that Constantius sponsored earned him a reputation of being a suspicious and paranoid emperor. But I think if we consider it from Constantius' perspective, we could also see these moves as pragmatic exercises of power. The reality was the West was not secure. It had gone through a string of rulers that were not Constantius. There were likely to be further uprisings and usurpations in those provinces. So this heavy-handed approach, though certainly of ethical dubiousness, makes sense from a pragmatic perspective. While Constantius was over in the east, he appointed his cousin, Gallus, who, if you'll remember, was one of a few survivors of that massacre of Constantine's family members in 337. Well, Gallus was left in the east to defend Mesopotamia against raids from across the eastern border. And there were regular incursions in the 350s, and even revolts. The Jews revolted, for example, in Galilee, destroying several cities in 351 and 352. But Gallus, like Constantius, had limited resources. He couldn't do everything himself. While he was over in Antioch, the easternmost capital in the Roman Empire, there were riots in that city and various forms of unrest, and Gallus decided to just blame the governor as a kind of scapegoat and have him executed. He also murdered his praetorian prefect, as well as one of his bookkeepers. These would all be people would have some role in distributing the grain or keeping financial records. And the point here was that Gallus probably had no idea why there was such a shortage. He just knew that heads needed to roll, and that's what he did. Constantius heard about all of this trouble back in the eastern half of his empire, and then he decided to scapegoat Gallus. So in 354, he had Gallus apprehended, put on trial, and then executed for treason in October of that year. And it was not just a normal beheading. This is what Ammianus Marcellinus says about what happened to Gallus. Quote, "The wretched Gallus was beheaded in the town of Pula by the executioner, and his head was brought to Constantius at Aquileia on a dish. And when it was shown to him, he ordered it to be hung up on a post in the middle of the forum, and then after a few days' interval, to be buried with his body." We don't have the records to suggest whether executed Gallus actually prevented unrest. There was probably a lot going on in the Eastern Empire, economically, environmentally, militarily, and executing Gallus was not going to fix those problems. Of course, it was yet another example of Constantius being especially cruel and barbaric, and so the reputation for paranoia and suspicion only grew after Constantius executed his cousin Gallus. Another problem with this execution is it pointed out a stark reality that Constantius did not have an obvious successor, and most of his family was dead, probably at his own hands over the course of the last 20 years. He was childless. And so at this point, there was only one male relative left in the entire Constantinian family. This was Gallus's younger half-brother, a man named Julian. Julian had been born in 331, educated in Athens by Neoplatonic philosophers. He had, despite growing up in a Christian empire, a more traditional non-Christian education, and this will be important later. Julian survived that purge back in 337 at the age of 6 because he was just too young. And then he survived the string of violence under Constantius in the early 350s because his half-brother was older and therefore was made Caesar before him. But now the musical chairs had stopped at Julian. He was the last one standing of possible family allies to Constantius. And so on November the 6th, 355, Julian had the misfortune, perhaps, of being appointed Caesar, second in command of the empire, to his cousin Constantius. Constantius had Julian married to his sister Helena, All of this was done to bind loyalties between the two of them. Julian was just 24 years old at this point, but he was given an immediate task. The whole reason to make him Caesar was to deal with the various problems in the empire. And it was Julian that was sent to the west, over to Gaul, where he would have to shore up Roman borders there. And Constantius did not give him very many resources. And this might be because Constantius was paranoid and didn't want to give him a large army. It could also be because there weren't resources to give to Julian. Either way, the number of troops he was given was a mere 360 men. So much of what Julian was supposed to do, obviously, was find soldiers in the West, in addition to defend that entire region from thousands, tens of thousands of raiding tribesmen. At the time, these were the Alemanni. They were a Germanic confederation of European peoples that had been raiding Gaul the last few years. And Julian, surprisingly, despite having very little resources to start, was relatively successful. So from 355 to 357, he largely cleared the Alemanni from Gaul. He recaptured Roman cities that the Alemanni had taken. He ended up getting an army of about 13,000 soldiers, much, much larger than the original 360 that he had. Of course, this was still about a third of what the Alemanni had. They probably had around 35,000 soldiers. But evidently, the education of Julian in Athens had included a great deal of military strategy. And he was able, with 13,000 troops, to defeat the Alemanni's 35,000 troops. And Constantius was pleased with this news. This looked very good. He minted coins in the following years proclaiming the glory of the army. Images on these coins showed Roman soldiers stabbing fallen barbarians. They showed soldiers flanking military standards. There was a strong sentiment in the empire by the mid to late 350s that order was being restored in the West. Constantius himself got in on the action. He went and fought Danubian tribes, the Suebi, the Quadi, the Sarmatians. He fought and won battles. He also engaged in some strategic resettlement, allowing some of these tribes to have lands in the Roman Empire in exchange for protecting those lands against some of these invading tribes. And again, here is Constantius's pragmatism on display. He was not as interested in annihilating his enemies as finding ways to use his enemies against each other, drawing on client kings, resettlement programs, and in some cases cash payments to try to shore up the western border. But despite these military successes in the 350s, there were ongoing religious schisms in the Roman Empire at the same time that really jeopardized Constantius's project of bringing together a very diverse and polarized population. Constantius wanted ecclesiastical harmony in the empire. So although he himself was an Arian, he was more than willing to compromise. Arianism, if you'll remember, was named after Arius of Alexandria, who died in 336. And the main controversy about Arianism is that it posits Jesus Christ, the Son, as subordinate to God the Father. Obviously, this clashes with the orthodoxy of the Nicene Creed, which affirms that Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit are co-equal and of the same substance, unified in a Trinity. So what did Constantius do to unify religion in his empire? Well, some of it was heavy-handed. He found some of the most dogmatic Nicene bishops, especially those that had been vehemently anti-Arian, and he had those men exiled and kicked out of their positions. There were several councils that backed up the empire. So the Council of Milan in 355, for example, supported the exile of numerous prominent bishops. Some of them had to just run and flee. The bishop Athanasius had to hide in the Egyptian desert after being assaulted by one of Constantius's officials. We actually have some comments from Athanasius in his own words. Quote, Constantius convened a council at Milan, and there he compelled the bishops by threats to subscribe to the condemnation of Athanasius. He sent letters throughout the churches, ordering that Athanasius should be excluded from Alexandria. Thus did the emperor, imitating the fury of the Arians, drive me from my church. That's Athanasius's Historia Arianorum. In 357, Constantius decided to visit the old capital of the Roman Empire, the city of Rome. This was the only time that he ever visited Rome. He entered the city on April 28th, a day which commemorated his 20th year after being appointed Caesar by his father Constantine. He toured the major monuments, the Forum, the Pantheon. He had an obelisk erected in the Circus Maximus. He commissioned work on St. Peter's Basilica, some of which can still be seen to this day. He also removed a significant monument from the Senate House, a monument called the Altar of Victory, which I'll say more about in later episodes. It was one of the older monuments still there in the city, dating way, way back to the middle of the Roman Republic. It would be a monument that would be removed and restored and removed again several times as the ideological and religious battles in the Roman Empire were fought over the next few decades. But the whole reason that Constantius had it removed was he wanted to affirm that he was a Christian emperor and this was a Christian empire. So there was no tolerance even for old, venerated, non-Christian monuments. But the lingering problems of Trinitarian versus Arian Christianity continued to cause Constantius problems. And so what he wanted ultimately to do was to convince the bishops in the Roman Empire to adopt some kind of creed that could be amicable to everyone. So there was a council held at Sirmium where a creed was produced to avoid controversial terms like substance. Another creed was drafted in 358, and then again another in 359, this one just calling the Son like the Father, but none of these really stuck. Arians and Trinitarians wanted their views to dominate the Roman Empire, and it just did not seem like it was possible to find compromise. While all this was happening, by the way, Constantius moved back to the east, and he dedicated a church called the Hagia Sophia. Now, if you have heard of this church, you have no doubt seen its magnificence still to this day in Constantinople. Constantius did not build that church, but on February 15th, 360, he imported several relics onto that site, supposedly the bones of Timothy and remains of a few apostles. And then he built a basilica, which was about 100 meters by 60 meters, with a silver altar, gold mosaics, and marble columns he pilfered from nearby pagan temples. This would be the imperial cathedral until the church was rebuilt into the form that now exists in Constantinople by the Emperor Justinian in 537. But it will be a little while before we get to Justinian. All of this activity, even if Constantius could not find a consensus on Arianism versus Trinitarianism, shows that he was nevertheless interested in unifying the church and stabilizing the theological warfare that was going on in the Roman Empire. It also reinforced the idea that the emperor was over religious matters. By 360, Constantius did not have much time on this earth. He didn't know that. But in addition to dealing with incursions in the West and attempting to pacify religious disagreements, amidst all of that, the Sassanid Persians took advantage of the various distractions. And the Sassanid king, Shapur, invaded and besieged Roman cities. There is an account in Ammianus Marcellinus from the city of Amida, which was besieged for 73 days, and it captures the sense of devastation wrought by this Persian invasion. Quote, "For 73 days the city endured until at last, after immense slaughter on both sides, it was taken by storm. The Persians lost 33,000 men." This massive death toll on the Persian side suggests that the army that Shapur brought over into Roman territory was massive, likely of a size and a level of training that Constantius was not going to be able to counter. So Constantius sent word to Julian, demanding as many reinforcements as he could send from the west over to the eastern front. And Julian had a choice in front of him. Things were going relatively well in the west. He had had success. He was officially Caesar. And he was the last man standing in the Constantinian dynasty, apart from Constantius. However, if he sent those soldiers over to Constantius, he may very well see the work that he had done in the West come to an end. If he didn't send those soldiers, he would likely make an enemy of his cousin and launch the Roman Empire into a civil war. What would Julian do? Would he send troops to his emperor, or would he disobey, launching yet another civil war in the Roman Empire? We will talk about what happens next on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.